Okay, so I thought surely we would never see anything about The Last of Us Online. It was buried and forgotten into the dustbin of history. But it seems like it may actually live on in a way, with the director of the game having now formed a brand new studio, and he's talking pretty openly about going and making something similar. I'll show this to you. This is an article from VGC. Again, I love VGC. You should bookmark them, check them out. I pretty much have their website open regularly. I refresh every morning to see if there's any breaking stories, because they write it really well, but they don't go into the realm of like stupid clickbait, and it's just refreshing that way. I had a moment of panic for a second. I held my hand over Todd, and then it was really warm, and I was like, oh no, is there a fire? And then I was like, there is. It's a candle. So crisis averted. That all happened in a moment as I was rambling about this. But anyway, continuing on. They, as you can see, director of the scrapped Last of Us Online says his new US Japan studio is making a cinematic multiplayer title, taking inspirations from this. Vinit Argawalm, who was at Naughty Dog for around a decade, was the game director on what was internally known as The Last of Us Online. But after the project was scaled back in size, the developer eventually announced in December it had been canceled. Now, in a new interview with GameSpark, Argawalm has said that he and former Naughty Dog creative director Joe Pettinati have formed a new studio because they want to create something similar. Specifically, Argawalm explained that they wanted to make a multiplayer game that offers the level of action found in typical single-player Naughty Dog game. Quote, my main titles were Uncharted 4, Thief's End, Uncharted The Lost Legacy, and The Last of Us Part 2, Argawalm said via machine translation. I worked on both multiplayer and single player. I was mainly in charge of boss battles, and Naughty Dog's boss battles are generally one-on-one situations, so I wanted players to feel like they were fighting a human player, not an AI, even in single player. To be more specific, I worked on the final boss in Thief's End and the fight between Ellie and Abby in The Last of Us Part 2. I used all my knowledge of multiplayer to create the feeling that you were fighting a human. A big part of what inspired me to go independent was seeing the potential in combining Naughty Dog's specialty, cinematic action, with multiplayer. Argawalm has opened an office in Japan, while Pettinati has remained in the US, with their game being developed across both bases, quote unquote. The team currently has around 10 staff in total, with plans to increase this to around 30. It's very interesting. I mean, they worked on this thing for years. You got to remember, The Last of Us Online was in production reportedly, my understanding, could be wrong, but my understanding is around 2019, towards the end of The Last of Us Part 2, they started kickstarting the online component of the game. It was going to basically be Last of Us factions in The Last of Us Part 2. At some point, they said, we could build this into its own spin-off thing. And so they spun it off, and it became The Last of Us Online, separate from The Last of Us Part 2. Of course, Last of Us Part 2 launches, critical acclaim, does very, very well. For a while held the record for the most Game of the Year awards of any game in history, and did very, very well. Over the next few years, they made a few key changes to the culture at Naughty Dog. For example, they got rid of crunch culture, so they now celebrate that they don't have that problem. They don't ask people to stay late. They don't do overnight development sessions. They don't let people sleep under their desks. Like, they're pretty proud about the major changes they've made. And they also worked for years on The Last of Us Online. And this was a project that Argawalm and these guys were very, very passionate about, it seems. And it's canceled and it's been tossed aside. And I'm sure that they didn't want to just leave it there and move on like nothing happened. So they've actually left and gone solo. Now, the good thing for them is that once you have Naughty Dog on your resume, I mean, he says, I've worked on Uncharted 4, Lost Legacy, and The Last of Us Part 2, and I worked on The Last of Us Online project for years. That is quite the resume. You take that to any investment firm and they're going to be like, ooh, yeah, take my money. Like, Naughty Dog, they know what they're doing. So you worked there for years. You were a game director there. Take my money. I'll invest in your studio. And so they, I'm sure, are getting some early funding and venture capital funding, and they'll be fine. They'll be fine. But as you can see, their new game, which Argawalm describes as a, quote, triple indie title, has now been in development for a few months. And while it isn't yet ready to show to the public, he says he has been playing it with friends every week. There's not much we can say yet, but the new game is a multiplayer game, and we aim to bring the cinematic action we've been familiar with from our previous titles to multiplayer, he said. We're already in contact with partners, and we expect to have more information to share in the future. Naughty Dog officially canceled the game in December of 2023, saying the game became so ambitious that it would have required a complete shift in the studio's focus for the foreseeable future. As you can see, they quote here from that post, in ramping up to full production, the massive scope of our ambition became clear. The statement from the studio said at the time, to release and support The Last of Us Online, we'd have to put all of our studio resources behind supporting post-launch content for years to come, severely impacting development on future single-player games. So we had two paths in front of us: become solely a live service game studio or continue to focus on single player narrative games that have defined Naughty Dog's heritage. And they chose the latter, which I think was the right choice, certainly. But it is fascinating to hear this. This also is interesting because Jim Ryan left PlayStation right around this time as well. And I don't think it's a coincidence that right as Jim Ryan announces he's just going to retire in the middle of a console generation, which already is very, very weird, they started undoing a lot of his live service direction. They canceled a bunch of projects. They shut down a handful of studios, and they shut down this Last of Us Online project. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was something that like Naughty Dog had been saying, guys, we really don't think that this is the right direction for our team. And once Jim Ryan was welcomed to retire, they gave them the green light to move on from it. That's the vibe I'm getting. Or maybe it was just honestly that Hiroki Totoki, he was initially CFO and now he's CEO. I think he probably told them, okay, if we're going to do this, like we're going to do it right. And you're going to basically turn into Bungie, but for this Last of Us Online project. Are you prepared to do that? And they were like, no. So they cut their losses. But either way, you can see now that the people that worked on it were passionate about it, thought there was potential for it, and liked the idea. They just didn't want to let it die and go away. And so they have decided to try and sort of, in a way, make a spiritual successor to it. It's not going to, of course, have any of the assets or any of that stuff, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's a lot of the same core ideas they developed for The Last of Us Online, but now just put in this new triple indie wrapper, as he described. It's got to be jarring, though, to come from Naughty Dog, where you have like all of these ridiculous resources and your games are so ridiculously cinematic and graphically impressive, and then go indie and you don't have those resources, and all of a sudden you got to scale it back and you can't be the perfectionist studio anymore. You got to be a little bit more pragmatic. It's got to be pretty jarring, but I wish them the best. I'm very, very intrigued because my typical stance on canceled games is that historically it seems clear, especially when you talk to devs like over a beer. A lot of them will say, like, when their projects get canceled, they're like, I get it. Of course, I was passionate about it. I worked on it for a long time and I thought we could figure it out. But like, I get it because it had problems. And that's true of a lot of things that get canceled. Like, a lot of studios are not going to cancel, or executives are not going to cancel something they think that is going to be really successful. They're not going to cancel something they think they're going to make millions upon millions of dollars on. They're going to cancel something they don't think is going to connect with players or customers, as they would probably say it. And so they walk away. Other times there's like external factors. Like I've said, I think a lot of the Microsoft layoffs have been heavily inspired or motivated, where they've been targeted, because multiple of the studios that have specifically gotten massive layoffs have recently unionized. So I think sometimes there's components of that where it's like, yeah, your game looked solid, but you're unionizing and therefore you're going to be really, really expensive. And so we're just going to say bye-bye. So sometimes that's a component. There's external factors here. But in this case, it seems like it was a decision between PlayStation and Naughty Dog, where they just literally said, this is going to fundamentally change who we are as a studio, and we would rather keep making single player games. We don't want to turn into Bungie, but for The Last of Us Online, we want to keep making single player games. And for PlayStation, those single player Game of the Year games are valuable. They sell consoles. They sell, a lot of people on the ecosystem. And so it's worth doing. But I'm sure they had some really interesting ideas, some clever ideas of what they could bring to the table, and I'm excited to see what they do with it. It's still, a while off. It's interesting. He's saying that he's playing with his friends every week, so they have a prototype even after just a few months, which is pretty standard. But usually, like with these types of games, a prototype of something like this is like, you know, of course, all gray box. It's like very, very bare bones and basic, but it gives you a good idea. I've done some gray box testing and some prototype testing for various studios and companies. And it's always fun because you can see like the really early idea of what the game is going to be. It's just, you know, everybody walks around in a T pose and, you know, all the buildings are just gray boxes, but you can start to see the vision of what it will be. It's pretty interesting. It's very cool. But yeah, as I said when we started the segment, I thought this was just going to be dead and buried. Maybe we see elements of it, copy and paste it into future games. Like if we ever get The Last of Us Part 3, I wouldn't be surprised if they're like, yeah, so this level is actually the map from The Last of Us Online. We just reused it. I wouldn't be surprised if we hear stuff like that because they spend a lot of time and resources on it. But I don't think we will see them like actually releasing this ever. I think it's pretty well going to be locked away. But you never know. You never know. Who knows? Maybe in like 6 months or a year or two, we'll have some build leak. Like if you missed it, they actually had a build of Concord, a development build of Concord leak online. I was actually able to download it and get it running. So you can actually play Concord even today. And people have found ways to get into the dev room and to mess around in the dev room and find out where they were building the game. It was pretty cool. It was honestly pretty cool. And maybe we'll get something like that for The Last of Us Part 2. Just somebody that was working on it had a copy of the game build on their laptop, and one day they just accidentally upload it to Pirate Bay or whatever. Stranger things have happened, you know? Stranger things have happened. But I wish them the best of luck. I'm excited to see what they do with their game. He took my thing.